So what I want to talk about now is faith and work. Have you guys ever heard that term, faith and work? From Tim Keller, right? He talks about it, yep. So maybe before we get into the material, just so I can have a sense for your guys' starting points, when you hear that phrase, faith and work, what do you think of? What do you think that's about? What do you think that might mean? Good, very good. So how do they influence their workplace? How do they influence their industry as Christians? Yep. Anything else? So to flesh that out, if you're a Christian and you're a painter, bringing your faith to work doesn't necessarily mean painting only Jesus, but it might mean painting beautifully and as excellent as you can, because your worldview tells you that beauty itself reflects God, and it draws people into an experience of God's own beautiful creation, something like that. Good. So for those of you who just came, welcome. So we're on page 34 of the handout. We're talking about faith at work, and let me just set the stage for why this is so significant. Your job as pastors is to disciple people to follow Jesus. That's what discipleship is. It's following Jesus in every part of your life. But here's the thing. Pastors are really good at exegesis, at pastoral care, at building community. That's the stuff that pastors do. But most of your people spend most of their time not doing church-related things, not doing church-related programs. They spend most of their time in their cities, with their families or friends, and if they have a job, with their workplace, with their colleagues, doing their job. If they don't have a job, probably a big part of what they're trying to do in their life is find a job. In other words, most people spend most of their waking hours working. Sometimes that work is paid, and sometimes that work is unpaid. The most common unpaid work is being a parent. It's a job, it's a vocation, but you may not derive a salary from it. But most people spend most of their time working. Therefore, if discipleship is about helping people follow Jesus in every area of their life, it's a major gap when the church isn't discipling people for their vocational life. If, just to make up random percentages, if a person spends 60 or 70 or 80% of their week working, and we have them for maybe 10% of the week on a Sunday in church, or maybe for a small group, we have to give them a vision for what their faith means for the things they do most of the time. That's what we're talking about now. And the way it relates to apologetics and cultural renewal is simply this. Your people are the ones who are going to change the culture in the city, much more than you will. If there's a person who works for, I think it was you, Aman, right? Ethiopian Airlines. So you used to work at Ethiopian Airlines. That's a huge presence in Addis, right? If you bring your faith to work in that space and God blesses those efforts and you show people what it's like to work excellently and diligently and with integrity, the possibility for renewal in such an important industry in a city like this is massive. And it's much more possible that way than assuming that those people are all going to come to this church on any given Sunday. So when we talk about apologetics and cultural engagement, the fact is that people working throughout the city are on the edge, or you might say the front lines, of cultural engagement. Therefore, your job as a pastor is to give them the theology and the support for how they can have a worldview which understands their work matters to God. Their work is important to the kingdom of God, and how they work as a Christian can have kingdom impact and kingdom effect. I saw that firsthand in New York City. If a church in New York City is not discipling people for faith and work, they're not discipling people, because people come to the city to work. Work is a huge part of life in New York. And if you're not paying attention to what people do with most of their time, you're not really giving them a full gospel. In addition, as we'll see, sin makes work really hard, and we use work in all the wrong ways. So we need to help people fight against idolatry that often is present in the workplace. Let me say one more thing. When I talk about faith at work, sometimes people think I mean being moral or being ethical. So if you're a Christian banker, it means not stealing money from your clients. Of course it does, at the very bottom. But that's not exactly what we're talking about today. What we're talking about is how does a Christian worldview give you an imagination for how the use of money and even the industry of finance can be redeemed and renewed to the glory of God. That's what we're talking about when we talk about faith at work. So before we get into what I'm calling a biblical theology of work, is this making sense, why we're talking about it in a class like this? You guys with me? So do you see why we're talking about this, why this matters, the kind of context for why it could be important? Now, I'll say, I was very interested by our conversation yesterday or the day before. I got the impression from you guys that a lot of people in your church would be or underemployed. And if that's true, then this conversation is not any less important, but it does change the way you're going to provide pastoral care. Because part of what you'll see is work is a fundamental part of our humanity. Therefore, finding ways to nurture skills and connectivity and networking to help people find jobs is going to be part of your work, part of your role as a church, because that's part of our humanity. It's part of what it means to represent God in the kingdom. And then for those who are working, you want to make sure that you're giving them the worldview that enables them to work in a way that brings glory to God, not just by being ethical or moral, but by imagining what renewal could look like in their industries. What I want to do now is give you a biblical theology of work. Do you guys know the term biblical theology? What is biblical theology? Maybe in opposition to systematic theology. You want to take a stab at it? Good, excellent. So where systematic theology might pick a topic and pick random texts, a biblical theology starts in Genesis and it goes to Revelation and says, how does this doctrine or this idea amplify and develop as the story goes on? Perfect, excellent. So let's do a biblical theology of work. We're going to start in Genesis and we're going to go all the way to the book of Revelation. Some of you know this stuff, others of you, this might be brand new. But I think and I hope by the end I'll show you why it matters greatly, especially for ministry in a city. So part one, we have 6 parts in this biblical theology of work. Part one, what we could call the goodness of work. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, God gives Adam and Eve jobs. They're in paradise. They have a perfect relationship with each other. They have a perfect relationship with God. There's no sin in the world. And God says you still need to work. So the first thing we learn is that work is a creational good. It's part of our humanity. In fact, work is one of the ways that we reflect God, because God works. God makes things. God makes things beautifully. And he invites people to enjoy what he's made. And so when you make things, when you work, when you take raw material and create something that contributes to flourishing, it might be ideas, it might be bricks, it might be law or policies, it might be currency. You might be strings on a guitar. When you take raw material and you work them together in such a way that it creates beauty and something that helps people flourish, you're actually doing what God did when he made the world. Notice also that in Genesis 2:15, God puts Adam and Eve in the garden. He gives them a job. He says, I want you to work the land. I want you to care for it. I want it to become fruitful because of your work with it. Those Hebrew verbs, to work, to care for, are the same Hebrew words that God will use to describe the work of priests in the tabernacle and temple. And I hope that you see from that, there's no such thing in the Bible as the sacred-secular distinction. The Bible doesn't say some work is sacred and some work is secular. In the Garden of Eden, helping plants grow was like a priest tending to the tabernacle. That's how God views his world. That's how God views work. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but one of the great contributions of the Reformation was the doctrine that all work matters to God, or what you might call the priesthood of all believers, that actually every person is engaged in in sacred work insofar as they work to do things that help people flourish and experience the presence of God on earth by looking or experiencing his creative and orderly beauty. So all work, whether or not it's spiritual, matters to God. In work, we reflect God and his image by being creative and good stewards of the resources that God has given the human community. All work matters to God, maybe with the exception of being an assassin or something like that. All work matters to God. And therefore, work matters to humanity. And to be underemployed or unemployed is really hard. It can be even, you might use the phrase, dehumanizing. Because literally, God gave human beings work as part of the creational order. I'll pause there. Any questions? Does that make sense? Of course, you don't have to go much farther in Genesis to realize that when sin comes into the world, sin impacts human beings' ability to work. And what you see in points 2 and 3 on our handout, so we have the fall of work, the first thing that sin does is it makes work frustrating and futile. Have you ever been frustrated in your job? Well, when you were frustrated at your job, you can blame Adam and Eve. Well, you can blame us too. Part of the reason why work is frustrating is because of sin. Because when human beings rebelled against God, we broke God's creational order, and work that was supposed to be meaningful and reflect God now became frustrating. And work is frustrating in a couple of ways. One way work is frustrating is that we're often able to envision more than we're able to actually produce. Have you ever tried to write a sermon and in your head it's going to be amazing, and then you try to get it on paper and you're like, gosh, this stinks? Have you ever had that?
Yes.
Yeah, some of us have. Every Sunday. What's that? That's the frustration of work. That you're able to envision more than you're able to produce. If you want to read a great story, short, by J.R.R. Tolkien, called about this very idea, it's called Leaf by Niggle. It's a story about a man who's a painter, and he has a vision of painting an incredible forest, but all he can ever eke out is one leaf. He can never get himself to go farther than that. And that's often our experience of work. Because of sin, we can envision much more than we can accomplish. Also, work is futile in the sense that sometimes we feel like our work's not doing anything. It doesn't have an impact. It's not making a difference. It doesn't feel satisfying. All of that, friends, is the thorns and thistles. Do you remember Genesis 2:15? God puts Adam and Eve in the garden and says, work it, take care of it. Sin comes into the world, and what does God say to Adam? Now the ground is going to be thorny and have thistles. The work you do is going to prick you. It's going to be hard now. This is the result of sin. So work is good, but now work is frustrating and futile, all because human beings turned away from God and rebelled against him. Your people, every single day, if they're employed, or if they're parents, and their vocation is parenting, are going to experience frustration and futility. And they need you to guide them and shepherd them so they don't give up, so they don't discount their work, and so they can see it as space for kingdom renewal. On this point, Tim Keller says, in all of our work, we're able to envision far more than we can accomplish, both because of a lack of ability and because of resistance in the environment around us. The experience of work will include pain, conflict, envy, fatigue. Not all of our goals will be met. The fall of work, frustration, and futility. But there's another aspect here in which work is broken, work is tainted by sin. That has to do with identity and idolatry. Can you guys come with me to Genesis chapter 11? The story, as you know, is the Tower of Babel. This is one of the turning points in the story of God. But let's look at it from the perspective or from the lens of faith and work. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, and they settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." From the perspective of faith and work, what do you guys see is going on in those verses? They're doing exactly what people do when they move to London. They come to work to make a name for themselves. That's what is happening in the Tower of Babel. They're working, as James says, for their own glory. And that's another aspect of how work is broken. That instead of work being a way that we honor and worship God and serve others, work becomes a way of building an identity for yourself. For most of the people that I interact with, this is the primary way that they form an identity. How successful they are at work. And so the mantra that comes into our heads and our hearts is, I am what I produce. If I'm successful at work, I'm successful as a person. By the way, pastors do this all the time. Preached a good sermon, I feel good about myself. Someone says that was a great talk, I feel better. The church is growing, I have a strong sense of identity. Sermon sucked, church is not growing, people are upset, I'm a terrible person. What is that? We attach our identity to our work. Why? Because work is so important. It's part of our humanity. It's fundamental to who we are. But sin knocks God off the throne of our heart, but something must be there. So we look to work to give us our identity. If we're producing, if we're achieving, if we're successful, then we know we matter. And therefore, work becomes idolatry. Work becomes a substitute God. The problem, of course, with any form of idolatry is that when it comes to work, as an example, if you're doing really well at your job, if you're crushing it, then you become prideful and you look down on anyone else who's not as successful or not as put together or who seems lazy. You become proud. Or if you're not doing a good job, maybe your boss is upset with you, maybe you're about to lose your job, if you get your sense of identity from work, you become despondent. You feel like you have no meaning in life and no purpose to live because your God is failing you, your God being your career or your productivity. So what happened in Genesis 11 is a revelation that people come together, they build, they use their creative resource and abilities to work together to do something that would ultimately destroy them, and it does, as verse 5 and following describes. But your people, to one degree or another, will look to work for identity and idolatry. Let me just say also, some of you might be thinking, oh no, the people in my church, they just do what they have to do to make a living, but they don't really care that much about their job. Don't forget that when we talk about work and vocation, we're not just talking about what you get paid for. Everybody has a passion. Everybody has something that they want to do in this world. It may not be the thing you get paid for. When I was in New York, I knew lots of people who worked as waiters or waitresses at restaurants, not because that's what they wanted to be when they grew up, but it's how they pay the bills while they try to make it on Broadway. So that's their vocation, acting. They just work at a restaurant to pay the bills. They don't think of that as the reason they're on earth. So sometimes the work that you're discipling people for is not necessarily the thing they get a paycheck for. And it's good to keep that in mind. I'll pause there. Any questions? You guys tracking with me? Okay. For this next one, I want to invite you to take a look at the passage. Maybe you can do it in small groups. But this is one of my favorite stories about the challenge of faith and work. So don't read the paragraph description yet that I've given you. If you already did, then you'll know. But turn in your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 5. Let me give you the context of 2 Kings 5. Some of you probably know the story, but let me just give you the context, and then I'll tell you what I want you to do. 2 Kings 5, Naaman is a commander of the army of Aram. He's a very powerful man. He was very popular, very loved, but he had leprosy. So a slave girl in his home, who happened to be Israelite, happened to be captured by the Aramites, says to the master, to Naaman, there's a prophet in Israel. He heals this kind of stuff. Why don't you go see him? So Naaman kind of reluctantly goes down to Israel. He finds the prophet, Elisha, and Elisha, heals him. The stories, the river and dipping, and he doesn't want to because it's a gross river, but he does anyway, and you know how it goes. So he's healed. So he's a Christian. I mean, we're this is pre-Jesus, but we're just using this as a sort of story, right? So now he's saved. He has faith. He's a believer in God. So he's about to return home, right? He's come from Aram. He's in Israel. He's about to go home to where he lives. But he has an exchange with Elisha the prophet before he does. So I want you to read these verses and see what they say about the challenge of bringing faith to work. So start in verse 16 and go down to the end of verse 19, okay? Just read those verses together and discuss where do we see a challenge in faith and work in this story? Verses 16 through the end of 19. Sorry, 15 through the end of 19. I love this story in the Bible. I think it's fascinating, it's complicated. So, why don't we start here? What is challenging about faith and work? So the way you guys read the story was you see Naaman in his request as doing something deficient in his discipleship. Like his request to be forgiven for bowing down in the temple of Rimmon is a reflection of compromising his faith or his values. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, good. What about you guys? What did you talk about? Yeah. So his job, he knows Rimmon's not a god. He doesn't believe in Rimmon. He doesn't worship Rimmon. But at his job, he has to do this thing where he goes into the temple of Rimmon and he has to sort of do what everyone else does, or else he loses his job, or else he loses his position. So maybe the question is he compromising, or is this something where it's okay? I want to press you guys a little bit here, and so let's use an example I gave a few days ago. So I'm a new pastor, young couple comes to me, just got married, and they say, clearly kissing someone who's not your spouse is wrong, right? God doesn't want that. But in my job, which is this incredible role on Broadway, I'm going to have to kiss somebody every single night that isn't my spouse. Pastor, what should I do? That's really hard. There's so many dynamics there, right? There's marriage, there's sexuality, there's recognizing that jobs have demands, there's recognizing that in the performance of art, you're not actually being your real self, right? If someone is an actor, they put on a persona to do a story that is not their truth. So many things going on there. And what if I said to them, go in peace? What would I be saying, in effect? Yeah. So when Elisha says to Naaman, go in peace, is he approving? Is he saying to Naaman, go ahead, bow down in the temple of Rimmon, no big deal, go in peace? The Lord knows. The Lord knows. Guys, what I'm trying to press on, what I'm trying to help you experience is that this stuff is extremely complicated. Like that's precisely the point, is that discipling your people to live out their faith in their jobs is very challenging. And if you're not a good listener, if you're not willing to wrestle with them as they think theologically about what it means to bring their faith to their work, you're not going to be helpful to them. And ultimately, they may think the church has nothing to say about me and my industry because they have all these simplistic and maybe naive ways of thinking about what it means to be a Christian in my space, but they don't really get it. So what this story shows us, I think, is not that Naaman was right or wrong, as much as it shows us that bringing your faith to your work is really complicated. Maybe Naaman was a new believer, and as he disciples and he grows in his faith, he'll realize, I can't do the bow down in the Rimmon temple thing anymore. Maybe he'll grow into a Daniel or a Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who have deep, mature faith and say in Babylon, we'll never bow down. Or maybe he recognizes, in order to have my position, which gives me tremendous power and influence for gospel good, I'm going to have to wrestle with the challenge of going into the temple of Rimmon. I'm not sure. But the interesting thing is Elisha, in my reading of the story, doesn't say to him, oh, no, that's compromise. You need to quit your job. And he doesn't say, oh, it's no big deal. Go for it. he almost doesn't answer. He says, go in peace. God's with you. You'll figure it out. Almost like that. And so my encouragement to you guys reading a story like this is to recognize that discipling people for faith at work is really challenging. You need to be humble. You need to be a good listener. You need to have a dialogue rather than assuming you always know the answers when people come with questions. And seek God together. And recognize that sometimes the conscience of the person that you're speaking to will be different than the conscience of the next person that you're speaking to. So this couple that I keep talking about, the one that's like, hey, can I kiss this guy on stage? What would you have told them? Yeah. So the questions are very good. So you're sitting with them, you're talking. You say, okay, I have some questions. What does the spouse think? State of their marriage, are they talking about it together? What kind of kissing are we talking about? Does that matter? And what kind of kissing are we talking about? So a couple of you guys thought she shouldn't take the role, but you do have some questions. Who thinks she should take it? But let me ask you this question, because this is something that you guys aren't reflecting on, that you haven't said something about. So you're talking about what does the spouse think, and how long is the kiss, whatever. But what about this question? What is acting? Like, what does it mean to be on stage and to tell a story? What if I'm on stage and I'm cursing? What if my job is to act a part where I blaspheme God? Like, what is acting? And how do we think about that in relationship to what it means to live as a Christian? Yesterday we talked about shadows and sunbeams, right? Is it wrong for a Christian to take a role where they act in an ungodly way? I agree with you. If the role for some reason required you to take drugs or something, these are all really important. That would be a weird role, but But yes, there are some kinds of portrayal of sexual intimacy, but I want to also say, sexual intimacy, for example, is a very obvious one. But if you have to take a role where you have to say things that you would never dream of saying because your character says it, if you have to portray someone who is abominable in world history, how do you think about it? So I agree with you, there are lines, of course, there have to be. But what I'm trying to press you guys to do is recognize we actually don't know enough about acting to really begin to figure out how to apply the theology that we know to this conversation. So what I had to do as a pastor was say, okay, let's start at the bottom here. Talk to me about how you guys think about every part of your life, because they were both Broadway actors. How do you think about the roles you take? How do you think about your discipleship in relationship to doing things that doesn't seem to cohere with Christian values? Were you going to mention something? Do you have to think about the impact on the viewer? Yes. Yeah. So you're talking about looking big picture at whatever the text, right? The artifact, the movie, the show, the story. What's its ultimate implication? What's it doing? I very much agree with you guys. There are lines to be drawn. There are certain things that are destructive both for viewer but also for persons participating. But what I hope you're realizing is that as pastors, our ability to guide our people in some of these spaces requires a lot more nuance than saying, the Bible says don't commit adultery. That's true. But we have to think very carefully about what we're guiding our people in and how to help them navigate the complexities of their industry vis-a-vis the theology and the worldviews that we are shaped by. In this particular case, I did what you guys are saying. I asked a lot of questions. I sat with them, many meetings. We processed scripture, we talked, we brought in other friends of theirs to try to make sense of this. And ultimately, I said, here's all the things that I think are significant. And the number one thing is your marriage has to remain strong and healthy. That felt to us like something that was paramount after all our discussions. And they said, we believe it is. We've talked so much about this. So I said, then ultimately, I think the decision is up to you, but you have to stay in a community. You have to be accountable. You have to be talking to each other about this. And you need to make sure that if you ever start to discern even the yellowest of flags, yellow meaning slow or caution, about what this could be doing either for the woman or for the marriage, you have to get counsel right away and maybe be willing to say, for the honor of Christ and for the good of my family, I might need to walk away from this role. So that's what they did. She ended up taking the role. She had it for about 6 months. Then she moved on. And they have a happy, healthy marriage with a couple kids now, still working in the church.
That was like go in peace.
It was kind of like go in peace. But it was a go in peace that helped them to process all of it in a way that wasn't a yes or no, but the Spirit of God is with you, so let's seek him together. And let's develop a theology that will help us encounter this. Now, I want to be really clear. It's totally possible that I could have had the same conversation with another couple, and we would have discerned, don't take this role. It's not going to be good for you. It's not going to be good for your marriage. It's not going to be good for your spiritual life. It's not going to be good for your family. You need to walk away. Right? So it isn't the case that the way that situation went is how every situation should have gone. And this is where we talk about what the Bible calls freedom of conscience. The idea that the Spirit of God might guide some Christian or Christians towards activity or behavior in mission that is different than he might guide others. And so Paul tells us in Romans, if your conscience allows you to eat meat, don't judge those who don't, but recognize that you're still one. So that's the other thing that I always try to say in this space is you can't assume that just because something went one way one time, it's always going to go that way. You still want to rely on the Spirit. And do you remember the story of David when he's going to war and he asks God, should we go and attack? And God's like, yes, go and attack. And then the next day or whatever, week later, he asks God the same question and God's like, no, don't go attack. And it's this great illustration of we need to always stay current with God. And I think the same is true in helping our people navigate the complexities of their vocational life. You never just say, all right, that worked once, we'll just do it forever. Question? On the other church members, like who might know that or see that? I think they appreciate, A, how careful the church was in walking with them and taking time and being prayerful. And then, it wasn't like everyone in the church knew. It was a big church and they only had a small community of friends, but that was part of what we talked about is you need to be honest and accountable in your community group. Their community group is a bunch of other, actors or theater types. And so you need to be accountable in your community group. You need to be talking about this with them. You need to be sharing. You need to be getting feedback and counsel. So overall, the group wasn't scandalized, like, oh my gosh, he's kissing somebody else. But they were saying, how good is it that we've thought so carefully about it? And we want to model that when we face challenging situations in our discipleship. So that was the impact. It was very positive, actually. Yeah, and then Brian, Mikey and Brian.
I was thinking.
So guys, this is really good. This is really good conversation because it's just making the point how challenging it is to disciple. Now, I've obviously chosen a pretty extreme example. There's a good chance, right? This kind of situation would never come across your pastoral desk. But the reason I choose it is because it's a perfect illustration of how challenging it really can be to put your faith out into work. I would suggest to you that if your answer to a question like that was without consideration, no, you cannot take that role, and that was sort of the policy, what would happen over time is people who were interested in the arts would find your church to be a place where they couldn't imagine what it is to be a Christian in their vocational space, because there's no space to wrestle with the complexities of the questions that come across their desks as people who work in the arts. So what I'm inviting you is not to as a pastor, bind your conscience to guide people in a way that you wouldn't be comfortable with. As a pastor, you might have landed and said, I just don't think this is right. And that could be okay. But if you do that without reflection, if you do that without really listening, if you do that without good theological reflection, and maybe even trying to find, is there a Christian in the arts who's much smarter than me that I could talk to and get some feedback about this? If that's not your instinct, then you're not going to create safe spaces for the people in your church to wrestle with the implications of their discipleship for their vocation. So I totally see what you're saying. I'll just say, a lot of people who make it to the level of like, I'm a Broadway actor, are able to do things like kissing or cursing or getting angry without it actually impacting them in an emotional or a spiritual way. I know that sounds hard to stomach or hard to imagine, but it's an ability that they've created as a very highly trained and professional actor. So whether or not that satisfies, that certainly is what I learned from the people that I was working with, not just those two, but others. But Brian, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking of an actor.
Yeah, we talked about that too. So the idea that if for some reason he finds himself crossing that line from a disconnected, this is not me actor to, wow, I like her, it's attracting, whatever. Yes, that would equally be probably a red flag, not just a yellow flag. And even if it was sad for her, that would mean she might have to eject from the role, because that's creating a really unhealthy dynamic. And it's not only even if he doesn't care, even if it doesn't, he's not a Christian, if he's not looking at it from that same perspective, it doesn't change the fact that she has a responsibility to him as neighbor, as colleague, to not lead him on in a way that would be ultimately destructive for their friendship, their working relationship, and just his own, humanity. So that was definitely a factor that we talked about. So, other thoughts before we wrap this up, James? I don't know that we talked about it in that specific way, but this is where I think we have to recognize the complexity of this conversation. So kissing, we are thinking of as romantic, as having a sexual element, and it does, no question about it. But what about holding hands? What if the couple had to hold hands on stage?
Or hug for a long time.
Hug for a long time? She sits on his lap? Like, what I'm trying to say is that I'm not at all suggesting, I don't know that I would take a role like that, right? I'm not at all trying to portray that their decision was the right one in the sense that every Christian should make the same decision. Not at all. What I'm trying to help you guys discern is how complicated these things are, because so many of them are not black and white issues in the sense that it's a clear violation of a command of God. It's the complexity of what is romance, what is physical intimacy, as well as what does it mean to be an actor or someone who's portraying a role that is not true to their actual person. So there are probably some lines as it relates to physical intimacy, but I think that's the question that you'd have to wrestle with is, is there a line that we can clearly say this is it and you can't cross it? If the most sort of neutral form of physical intimacy is something like holding hands, and then the most explicit would be like intercourse, if you decide that in the role, in an acting role, intercourse would never happen on stage, right? Broadway actors would never do that. And most TV actors or film actors would never do that either. They have ways of making it look like that, but it's not that. The point is that you have to have a line that you maybe wouldn't cross, but I'm just saying that it's not as simple as, well, we decided that this is the line, it's too far. It's actually pretty complicated, I think. Does that make sense? It's a little rambly, but guys, this is awesome. We just spent half an hour proving my point. It's really challenging to bring your faith to your work. And my encouragement to you guys is embrace the challenge. Walk with your people. For most of your people, the way this kind of challenge manifests itself is something like, my colleagues like to go to the bar, or whatever you would call that here, after work, and they say terrible things, and they drink too much, and I don't know if I should go with them. And that's where the challenge starts to come in for a lot of the people that's a more normal challenge. Or, in my company, people always, clock in, earlier than they actually arrived, that kind of thing. So everybody does it, kind of thing. It's like, those are the challenges, and there might be some more clear guidance that you could give. Were you going to say something? Yeah. You just have to determine whether or not you think that what's happening on stage or in the show behind the camera is itself spoken to by the words of Ephesians. So some people would say yes, that Christians should never do anything in a role that contradicts what Scripture says. Others would say when you put on the persona of acting, when you step into that job, you're portraying a role that is not a reflection of your true humanity, your true discipleship. True humanity is probably the wrong phrase, but you're not, this is not you. You're acting, you're putting on a persona to tell a story that may be really dark and sad, but is reflecting God in the term of the shadows that we talked about yesterday. So that's all I would say, is you have to come to a conclusion of whether you think verses like Ephesians 4 apply without distinction to any kind of possible role in the acting world, in which case Christians would not be able to do many roles at all. I mean, they'd basically be working for Christian film companies, because most movies would have things that would, contradict Christian values in one way or another. Or you would say, I'm able to envision a scenario in which, within the confines of the story, that I can act in a certain way, I can do certain things that isn't disobedience to Christ, because I've put on a persona to tell this story. There are a couple of really good books. If you really want to read a lot more about this, I would encourage you to find books by a guy called Jeremy Begbie, Begbie. If you really want to go deeper in this topic and explore, some more about specifically acting in theater and how you would imagine Christians in that space. So I like how you're thinking about it, Brian. And I think some of us would lean on the side of like, no, you shouldn't do that. And I think that's okay. I'm just encouraging you guys to be really reflective and humble as you guide your people in all the ways that they try to live out their faith at their work. Because it's a lot harder for them than it is for us. We have it pretty easy living out our faith at work. But they have it a lot harder.